Well, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alan Dugan. Welcome to this 3P Learning podcast titled Leading in Uncertain Times. I'm really glad that you could join us today, and I hope that across the next 50 minutes or so, we can spend some time unpacking some of the ideas and challenges that leading in these interesting times presents us as leaders in schools. As I said, I'm really glad you could join us today, and if you have been with us during any of our webinars during the last 6 or 7 months, you'll have a bit of a feel for the format and the layout of these webinars. Really, they are about trying to facilitate some conversation, trying to make them as useful as possible for you and not really a waste of your time. So during the next 45 minutes or so, I'm joined by Chris, who'll introduce himself in a moment or two. But during the next 45 minutes or so, we really hope to share with you some insights around what it means to be leading in uncertain times, leading during this pandemic, and some of the things that we have learned from speaking to teachers, from research that we've done, from surveys and so on. So I'm really glad you could join us. I'd love to encourage you to jump onto the question part of the GoToWebinar control panel and introduce yourself. Tell us where you are, what your role is, and what's front of mind for you as you stare, I guess, down the barrel of leading right now in these uncertain times. I know that the time zone for this webinar means that the majority of the people dialing in are from the US and Canada, Chris, or from the UK. And so I know that you are facing the start of a school year compared to Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, etc., who are coming towards the end of the year. So we're really focusing on what it looks like to lead with a full year ahead of you. So I'd love to encourage you to jump into that question section, introduce yourself, and tell us what's front of mind for you as you look at the year ahead. And while you do that, I'll let Chris introduce himself. I'll then introduce myself a little bit more and frame up what we're going to talk about for the next 50 minutes or so. Chris.
Good morning. My name's Chris, as Alan said. I've been a high school maths teacher for around 10 years, both in Australia and the UK, and also spent some time in school leadership. Have been out of the classroom now for a couple of years working for 3P, and I love the classroom. I miss the classroom, but it's been really nice to actually step out and spend the time thinking about researching those things that I really wanted to when I was a teacher, but was just too time poor. It's been really enjoyable actually equipping teachers for the tough job that it is of actually teaching. So yeah, we're looking forward to having a conversation. We don't have all the answers, but we want to build that community today. We're also very aware that there's no two schools that are the same. Some of us are full face-to-face, some of us are full remote, and then everywhere in between. So looking forward to having a conversation and really hoping you get something out of today.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I'm glad that you are with me this morning. As I said, I'd introduce myself a little bit. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name's Alan Dugan. My role here at 3P is Global Head of Education. That means that I'm responsible for kind of education strategy, some research, some kind of thought leadership, liaison with schools, teachers, and so on to kind of understand the climate of what's going on. And so I'm really glad that you are with us today. I'm really glad that you are here. As I said, my background is in teaching as well. I spent about 15 years, a little bit more than that, in the classroom. I taught in Scotland. You'll tell that my accent is not originally from Sydney, although I am in Sydney now, but I taught in Scotland and in Australia, both as classroom teacher and in leadership in both of those places. Most recently, I led a senior school in a private school just north of Sydney. So I've been at 3P now for about 4 years, and as I say, my role here is Global Head of Education, which has really meant over the last 9 months, that's really changed or been a really interesting journey, because the biggest part of my role for the last 9 months has really been interacting with schools, with districts, with local authorities to really understand the challenges as best I can, and to see how different schools and systems and areas are approaching these challenging times. And as Chris said, there's absolutely no, we know this as school leaders, but there's absolutely no one size fits all. And that's even more so true today when we think about the diversity of approaches. As Chris said, we've got some schools, some districts, some local authorities who are fully remote at this point in time. We've got some who are fully face-to-face, and then we've got a huge diversity of strategies in between, from a hybrid approach that sees certain year groups in on certain days to half the alphabet in on other days, and so on. And so there's a real diversity of approaches to try and solve the challenges that we face. And so, as Chris said, I really hope that in the next hour or so we can really facilitate a conversation that's helpful and useful. We certainly don't have all the answers, but hopefully we've got some good insight and can facilitate some good conversation. So please make full use of that question section. It's not necessarily the most ideal place to navigate conversation, but we'll do our best to try and keep that conversation going in terms of interaction and so on. And so I think let's start, Chris, by I'm going to ask you the question that I've asked the people joining us. What do you think is the most challenging part of leading at the moment in a school setting?
Well, that's a tough question. I think for me, going in, especially at the start of the year, we have our plans, we have our strategies, we have our go-tos of what we do across all the different aspects of the school. So in terms of students, staff, yourself, the community, all these different strategies that we implement year in, year out, and yes, we refine those strategies. I think the really hard thing is, in light of this pandemic, what strategies stay the same, what need to change due to this pandemic, but also what can we actually throw out? What do we need to get rid of? So having a look at all the things that we do and saying, well, what needs to change in order to look after this school, in order to lead this school, to lead these staff, to lead the students well in light of all this. I think that's a real challenge.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think in the middle of all of that, there is these ongoing expectations that are placed upon us. And these expectations come from different spaces. The expectations that come from above. So, from our systems, from our districts, from our local authorities, there's those expectations. There's the expectations that come from our community, parents, students, other key stakeholders in our community. Then there's the expectations that come from our teams and our students of how things should be and look like. And then probably most significantly, there's the expectations that come from ourselves. We know as leaders, leaders in education in particular, we have incredibly high expectations of ourselves, and we drive ourselves and we push ourselves really hard. And I think that is one that is absolutely important to think about and reflect upon as we go through it. So loosely speaking, Chris and I have got a bit of a structure today. We hope that over the next little while we're going to be able to have a bit of a conversation in a few buckets. We want to talk about what it means to be leading well from a perspective of our students and what that looks like. And we want to think about that not just in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of well-being and kind of safety and so on. We want to think about what it looks like to lead well from the perspective of community. And I think one of the things that's been said, and I don't necessarily like the language of it, but one of the things that's been said is we're really on a wartime footing in terms of how we approach things. And we know that in times of crises, in times of panic and kind of uncertainty, people look to establishments and the institution for that community, that sense of that kind of sense of being. And so we know that there's lots of research out there that would suggest that parents and other members of the community are often looking to schools for strength and kind of guidance. So students, community, want to talk a little bit about what it means to be leading our teams, our teachers and staff during this time. And lastly, but most importantly, we want to talk about what it means to be leading ourselves well during this time. And from that, we've got a few insights that we've learned along the way. So hopefully over the next hour or so, we'll be able to unpack some of that. So Chris, let's start off talking about students, and let's start off talking about curriculum. Often the focus is on delivering this phenomenal curriculum, making sure that we've got all the bells and whistles on curriculum, that we're really thinking about learning styles, we're thinking about teaching styles, we're thinking about how we deliver this innovatively and that innovatively. And yet here we are in the middle of a pandemic where we really don't know whether we'll still be face-to-face tomorrow, whether we'll have to kind of pack up our suitcase, so to speak, and go to a full remote, what it looks like. So for you, Chris, what should we be thinking about as leaders in terms of the curriculum expectations that we have for our teams and our students?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one coming in, especially because there's a lot of sort of press about saying, look at the learning loss that's taken place. Look how much students have lost. Look how much of the curriculum they haven't covered. And we have mandatory requirements as school leaders of implementing that curriculum, of hitting those dot points and those outcomes and whatever we call them. So the real pressure coming back in is, should we just sort of compress this in? Should we just sort of do it at double time? And that is a real temptation. We've seen a lot of teachers around trying to do that, but I think that's going to become counterproductive. I think what we need to do is we need to firstly look at the social and emotional well-being of students as they come in. They're coming from who knows what life's been like behind the scenes, but every single one of these students is going to have been sort of exposed to a certain amount of trauma. They're all going to be coming in a different headspace, and so addressing those social emotional needs first is going to have to be so important before we actually start looking at, well, let's pick up the curriculum. Otherwise, it's going to be really counterproductive. I think one really important note, which sometimes is easy to skim over, is that yes, the students may not have been in the curriculum like they normally do. I think there is sort of even a wider gap than previously. You had the students that really fit that sort of the mold of doing remote learning, who have really exceeded and excelled, and then you've got the students whose house maybe wasn't that, maybe their personality or their learning style didn't suit that, and so there's this big gap. So we've got to address that. But one thing we need to really acknowledge is that there has been a lot of learning taken place. It might not be learning in the curriculum per se, but there has been a lot of real life learning. These students have learned how to deal with a pandemic. They've learned resilience. They've learned a whole lot of perspective. They've learned to be flexible, having to manage their time. And so a lot of these real life skills that these students, it's probably been the biggest learning curve of their life, the last 6 months to a year. So they have come back with an extreme amount of learning, but it might not be in the curriculum. And unfortunately, that's a bit of the gauge we use sometimes.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you. I think that we ought to be careful to focus entirely on the learning loss. We need to acknowledge it. The reality is that if we are going to look at learning through that narrow lens of curriculum, and let's be honest, our systems require us to measure and report against this narrow view of curriculum. But if we're going to look only through that lens of what's been lost, then we're going to already have ourselves starting on the back foot. And the reality is that we absolutely do have learning loss. You know, for the vast majority of students in the Northern Hemisphere, they left school sometime around March, April, and they didn't come back to September. Now, yeah, they had remote and so on and so forth, but the gap between our students will have increased. There'll be some, as Chris said, who has really thrived, and some who have really struggled in that. And so there's this real temptation for us to focus completely on filling the gap of that learning. And then the challenge of that is that we have another year's worth of curriculum to get through against the backdrop of a pandemic. And will we, as I say, go to remote again, and what will that look like? And so, you know, I want to talk about the well-being of students in a second, and the trauma that they've experienced and so on. But as we think holistically about curriculum, we need to not just reflect on the loss, but we also actually need to think about what's ahead. And we need to think very strategically about the year ahead, because the reality is that the time continues to move on. These students will progress into another year. The results of 2020, the impact of 2020 on their education will continue to travel with them. And so as we think about the year ahead, we need to think very strategically and creatively around the space of curriculum. What are my plans as a school leader for assessment this year? Does it look different to what we've done in the past? How do we do it differently? Is there a way to approach assessment in a way that helps not just, as I say, I taught in Scotland, and one of the most helpful and insightful documents that ever came out of a local education authority was the assessment is for learning documents of the kind of early 2000s, and that whole idea of assessment as part of that learning journey and the importance and fundamental importance of that. So, what does it look like as we think about the year ahead to plan in assessment? It's probably going to be different to what a normal year would look like. What does it look like to report? How do we plan to report? And many of you will be sitting there going, please don't talk about reporting. We're at the start of the school year. How do we do that? I think one of the things that's insightful is, having watched Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other kind of Southern Hemisphere systems go through this school year. And for those of you that are not aware, Southern Hemisphere schools go calendar year school years. So January to December is a school year. And so the Southern Hemisphere has had a whole school year disrupted through it. And one of the biggest challenges and stressors for the systems, for the teachers, for the leaders just now is that end of year reports, because there's been all these changes to the approaches to assessment. There's been all these missed things throughout the year, and so we've got all these teachers now going in systems going, how do I report? What does that look like? And we need to, so thinking about that up front, thinking about that now, I think is really helpful to be having some foresight into what's going on and what it's going to look like. So for me, that's something that's really important. And think about what progress looks like. Progress is absolutely much wider than just curriculum outcomes. And I know, as I say, I know that I'm speaking very idealistically. I know that we have the requirements of our systems. I know that we've got the building blocks of curriculum that say, if we don't get through all of this next year, there's even more of a gap. I acknowledge all of that. And I think that's important and something that needs to be considered. But progress is much more than just a curriculum outcome being satisfied. It's about how we add value to the young person holistically, and how do we do that in the middle of a pandemic? How do we do that when we don't know if we will still be in school next week? The UK in the last 24 hours has increased its restrictions again. It's heading into another wave of the pandemic. People are having to work from home. Schools are looking like they're closing. Now they didn't plan for that last week. That wasn't the anticipation last week. Here we are again. How do we move around, and how do we try and minimize the disruption? I think is really important. And there's no quick fix. There's no quick answer to this. But there's a real need to give careful consideration to how we deal with curriculum, and it's not just about compression. Compression is not going to work for anyone. In fact, it's going to be counterproductive. It's going to add stress to our staff, it's going to add stress to our students. We know that under stress, people don't learn, people don't deliver well. So trying to compress in more to less time is not going to work. So we need to be quite strategic about that. And I think that's really important. Chris, did you want to add anything else about curriculum before we can talk about well-being?
No, I think the only thing I probably would add is that idea. Yeah, we need to be creative. There is that curriculum learning loss. Not extravagant, but creative. Little things like potentially looking at the assessment schedule and saying, is there some way we need to do a bit of give and take here? Is there some way we can buy back time, and rather than having an assessment for this outcome, and for this outcome, can we have an assessment that incorporates them, rather than having lessons and I suppose learning sequences that sort of spend a bit of time on each one? Can we do rich tasks that incorporate? Can we be creative? How can we leverage those students that have learned well, help them to sort of help the students that didn't do as much learning? Just being creative and encouraging our teachers to work in that sense. But no, I'm looking forward to talking about student wellbeing. So take over.
And I think it's, to kind of move into the conversation about student wellbeing, I think it's really important to note that we can't separate out curriculum and student wellbeing as much as we're separating it out in this conversation. It's impossible to do. And I think I was reading an article, I think it was the LA Times yesterday, that was talking about the trauma that every person has experienced during this pandemic. And it was referring to baseline trauma, and that whole idea of the fact that every single person around the world has had some sort of baseline trauma associated with the pandemic. And I think that is as true for students and young people as it is for us adults. Every single one of us has been affected by this pandemic in one way or another, some more than others. But I think as we think about our students, we have to remember that. We have to remember that even for the student who has thrived in remote learning and teaching, who is maybe introverted with a really safe home environment where they have thrived, they have still experienced the uncertainty of this pandemic. They've still experienced daily and nightly news reports that talk about an increase in cases and deaths, and this adds to a trauma. So we've got some students who, even the students who have had the most positive experience in the last 9 months, still are carrying some trauma. And then if we consider the students at the other end of the scale who have had huge exposure to trauma, maybe they've been impacted directly by the virus, and someone they know has sadly lost a battle with it. Maybe their home environment has been impacted by their caregiver losing their job, and finance has been impacted. Maybe their home situation is not a safe one, and they look to school for safety, and they've kind of been thrust out into the unsafety of their home environment for 6, 7, 8 months. And so we've got the gap between our students, the inequality is absolutely increased. And we add over that a kind of layer of trauma that everyone carries in. And we got to acknowledge that that's going to have an impact in our school communities. It's going to have an impact on the baggage that students carry, and it's going to have an impact on how they interact with each other, with teachers, with everyone in the school community. And I think as we think about that, we've got to actually strategically plan for that, right, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can't do curriculum without that social and emotional well-being, and I think what we need to, you can't underestimate the value that school has in the lives of these young people, especially in light of what we've seen. School and their teacher, especially for those younger students, it's that calming presence. It's the source of connection, their emotional support. It might be their one safe place. So we can't underestimate that. And so we need to keep that in mind when we're talking to our teachers about how they're approaching and the unknownness of how long they're even going to be in the classroom. That question of what's the priority? What's the priority if I only have my students for a week? I know there's a real temptation for teachers to say, I'm going to assess, find where that learning loss is, find where they're at. But I would be encouraging them to build that relationship with the student, because that's the thing that's going to sustain and facilitate that learning if we do go remote or some sort of hybrid model. That's the thing that's going to make the future of this year possible, and that's going to be the thing that helps that student far more than coming in and assessing where they're at. So you have that strong relationship, and that's going to make that online setting far more conducive for learning that curriculum. And we've seen that a little bit, I think, in Australia, where teachers had the chance to build that relationship, and then they went offline. I suppose it was far more beneficial having that relationship in place. I think it's much more of a challenge when teachers come back in and start their classes off new, trying to do these things from the start.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think about as leaders as we kind of plan ahead is, like I said, schools we seek as leaders to create safe environments. We want them to be places where young people feel safe, where our staff feel safe, where the community feels safe. And we'll talk about the community in a second, but in terms of that feeling of safety, everything's changed. We're trying to practice social distancing even in the school environment. For many of you, your teams will be wearing face masks or other forms of PPE. We'll be looking at, hand sanitizing more frequently. We'll be changing processes and procedures. And for our young people, and this is probably a really obvious statement, but it's really hard to think about how we actually make that happen. But we need to think about how we build in the safety for our young people, because PPE arguably creates a sense of unsafeness, when in actual fact it's bringing in safety. But for young people, it creates a sense of a lack of safety and insecurity. You know, in a place where they used to feel safe, they actually now might not feel safe. So I think as we think about how we actually create a safe environment, we mustn't take for granted. You know, one of the things as leaders that we do so often, and we are kind of focused on directly and indirectly, is having a really positive culture in our schools. How do we build positive, safe, thriving cultures? And the restrictions around this pandemic actually run the risk of destroying that if we're not proactively thinking about it. So yeah, we've got PPE requirements, yeah, we've got hand sanitizing requirements, yeah, we've got social distancing requirements, and the list goes on. I don't need to see it to you. You've got memos all over your desk, I'm sure, about it. But all of those things unintentionally are working to damage our culture. And so we need to think about how we build in that safety, how we help the children on the journey to understand it and to move it. And I think that that's really important, and that's really significant. And I think that we ought to think about that as we move forward, because we need to create a safe environment. And I think that, you know, one of the things that's really important in that journey, and I see we've got a couple of questions coming in that we'll kind of get to in a second, but one of the things that's really important in that journey is thinking about the role of parents in this. You know, up until the start of this journey, parents were stakeholders that we actively encouraged to come on site, that we actively encouraged to have a partnership with face to face, that at the start of the school year we work hard to build strong relationships with, so that if we need to have a hard conversation with them, we've got a baseline relationship with them to work on. Yet here we are now actively discouraging, in some cases banning, parents from being on school sites. And so how do we creatively build relationship with them? We ought to be very careful not to just say, okay, we're not allowed to have parents on site, so there we go. We need to think about, okay, we're not allowed to have them on site, so how do we build relationships with them creatively now? How do we actually enhance that relationship? What is it that we used to do face to face, whether it be meet the teacher, whether it be an open evening, whatever that might be? We used to do it this way. How do we do it now? How do we harness the power of technology, for example? Is it a case of I've heard of some schools that have, for the first term, are going to have a Zoom link on a Tuesday afternoon from 2 till 3. Parents drop in if you want to see what's going on, and there's a camera kind of set at the side of the room. Now that's a bit Big Brother is watching, and some people will be uncomfortable with it, but I'm not saying that's what we should do, but there's some ideas around that are really important. I think that leads into one of the questions that we've got here, Chris, that what are some suggestions for building relationships with students who are already online? So not just students, and I'll throw this one to you, Chris, but not just students. How do we build relationships with stakeholders who are only online or already online?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one, because it's an sort of unprecedented technique of building relationships. And so I think firstly we have to be deliberate. Don't think it's just going to happen. You can do that when you're face to face and you have the car park interactions, but if we don't actually plan for it and we're not deliberate about it, it's not going to happen. I think I'd probably be encouraging my teachers to harness to leverage technology a little bit. I am wary, so that sort of synchronous type communication that you're talking about, that real time, I think that is fantastic, but it can be quite difficult, quite challenging, and quite heavy, I suppose, emotionally as well. I think there's a lot of value in asynchronous type learning and communication, which is just a fancy way of saying making a video and then posting it up. And I think there's a lot of benefits from doing that with the students and with the teachers as well. I've heard stories of students sort of having their daily message from their teacher, and it might only be a minute. Good morning, how are you going? It's this person's birthday or whatever. And the student just watches it like 5 or 6 times in the day, and they come back and they watch it again. It's a real sort of source of connection. It means you don't have to do the real time and sort of rely on everyone being online at the same time. But you could easily you could encourage your staff to do sort of messages home that incorporate the student and the parent as well. Hey carers, this is what we've been doing in class, and so teachers are very creative and very good with that. But that's an easy way of sort of building that that consistent connection, and that'll help form those relationships and feel students will feel connected as well. That's potentially one idea.
Yeah, and I think that way to connect, how do we connect our students if they're all already online? Think about some of those start of year things that you would normally do in the classroom, the getting to know you activities, and then how do we change them into a digital activity, whether that be a kind of PowerPoint presentation of some sort that introduces themselves to the rest of the class, a video, something that allows them to do it. And I think, on the back of that, the same is true around our parents as well. We want to build those connections, and often them seeing you and hearing you is really relational building, even if it's not in real time. So even if it's not a face-to-face, them seeing your voice is really relational building. So think about, for example, taking your newsletter to a different digital format. And we know that the attention span of the swipe generation, as they're referred to, the Facebookers, the Instagrammers, the TikTokers, is much less. There's more chance of them watching a video than there is of them reading a newsletter. So is this a chance to vlog your newsletter, your weekly or your fortnightly or your monthly newsletter? Is this a chance for you to, vlog it? Is it a chance for you to do something slightly differently? Often in a situation of crisis, we kind of go to the trusted and tested methods, but there are places to adjust and change it. So I think there's a real opportunity to think about how we engage our community, our students, in different ways, in ways that are new or innovative, and achieve what it is we're trying to achieve. So always be thinking about what's the end goal, what's the outcome, what is it that I want to achieve, and how can I go about doing that as best I can. And I think that, I go, Chris.
So I was going to say, I think what you're saying is really important, but the optics of that to the parent community are really important as well. If the parent and wider community actually seeing the school trying these new things, trying to be innovative, trying to build that relationship, that goes a long way to building that rapport. I know of a few local schools that have sort of said, no, look, we're going to keep doing the same thing. We're not going to cater for any of these new needs. And you can sort of see parents a little bit deflated, whereas you see other schools that are at least having a try, even if it doesn't work, even if it fails. You can see parents really rallying behind it and really supporting them, because there's that real give and take, and we're in this together. Sorry.
No, I think you're completely right, and that whole idea of how do you work together to solve the problem, and that's where having strong relationships, effective relationships with key stakeholders such as parents is really helpful and important and significant. Let's keep going. I'm aware of time, Chris, and there are some questions that I want to get to as well. But let's keep moving for a second. Let's talk about our teachers, our teams. I think that one of the most challenging things for any leader at this point in time is knowing how to effectively lead our teams. And it goes back to what you were alluding to a few minutes ago about understanding the climate. We have to adjust our expectations with our students, with our parent community, because of where we're at and what's going on, and managing those expectations. And I think the same is true of our teams. We need to manage expectations of our teams differently. And that's not me saying compromise. I think often when we say manage expectations, that's people hear that as code for, actually just compromise standards and kind of let things slip through that you wouldn't normally slip through. But I'm not advocating for that at all. I'm saying that we need to think about what we've got. We've got teachers who have potentially never had to embrace technology before, now having no choice but to engage with it. We've got the whole idea of us moving into this space where, if you think about it, the teachers that we had, our most experienced teachers with the most profitable skill set in terms of pedagogy and education, all of a sudden don't necessarily have the most developed skill set to deliver online virtual remote learning and teaching. And in actual fact, those that were kind of sitting at the top, the kind of most revered, the go-to teacher in terms of the expert, all of a sudden has lost their confidence in terms of what it looks like to have good pedagogy, what it looks like to have good educational outcomes. And in fact, we've got then these emerging new teachers who are less likely to have excellent, well-developed pedagogy at this point, but actually are tech native, coming up and going, I'm feeling a little bit more confident, I'm feeling a little bit more relaxed about adjusting and changing to a remote or hybrid setting. And so we've got all of the dynamics of teacher confidence in that space, where in the past we could see a hierarchy of teacher confidence, a hierarchy of capabilities, and of course I'm stereotyping a little bit here, or generalizing a little bit, and I'm generalizing not because it's good to, but because I think it's helpful in this case. We've got that, what was a hierarchy of experience, of knowledge, of skill set, and it's kind of thrown all over the place, almost turned upside down. And I think we need to think about how we manage that. We add that into the mix of teachers who are worried about themselves, who are worried about, they may well have been shielding, they may well have been have underlying health conditions, and so their anxiety levels are higher. Their fear of getting the virus or coming in contact with the virus heightens their kind of worry and stressors. So we've got all of these complexities in the mix, Chris, that makes managing and leading our team a real challenge. Where do we start with that?
Yeah, I think it is a real challenge, and I think firstly we need to listen to the staff coming in, just like the students. They're all coming in with a different amount of experience, exposure, trauma to what's happened. So really making sure that they're feeling heard, making sure that they see a give and take, and you trying to walk with them. But I think a lot of the way I'd go about things stems from the conversation you were just having. Often we will sort of pair teachers up, and we'll think of it, here's a senior teacher. It's a bit of a one-way relationship where they're mentoring a younger teacher. I think this is a really wonderful opportunity to say, you know what, let's pair them up, but this is a partnership now. So whilst the senior teacher has that experience, has that pedagogy, has that sort of 20 years under their belt or whatever, you've got this new person that now actually holds a little bit more ground, in the sense that they have some strategies. They're a tech native, and that can be a really wonderful complementary relationship rather than just a one-way relationship. So I'd be looking at trying to harness those relationships, trying to really leverage those tech savvy teachers, not just from a learning perspective, but how we can sort of streamline or augment some of those tasks that are quite difficult, especially for those teachers that aren't necessarily as tech savvy. So I think there are some real opportunities in how we can lead our teams coming out of this.
Yeah, and I think in all of that, let's think about what builds team historically, and what builds effective. I used to get laughed at in school because one of my buzzwords was building effective reflective practitioners, and I really believe that that's something. I could see that smile on your face there, Chris. I really believe that the effectiveness of a reflection is something that is really significant and important. And I don't think that's any less true in a time of crisis. In fact, I would argue that it's more true. But I think about what reflection looks like. And I think as leaders, we would all acknowledge that unless it is ingrained in our culture and ingrained in our community, it's this kind of rigid fakeness. So when I force my team to reflect, sit down and complete this reflection, or I want you to have a conversation and answer these 3 questions in a staff meeting with your partner or whoever you're paired up with, that there's a rigidity and a kind of awkwardness about that reflection. But in actual fact, I think if we think about our cultures and what we're trying to create in our ecosystems of schools, the most effective reflection happens over a cup of coffee at recess. The most effective reflection happens in the hallway at the end of the day, when I've just had a really bad afternoon with my class, and it didn't matter what I tried. I thought I had this fantastic lesson plan. I did this, and this, and the wheels just come off, and I debrief and I get some ideas and so on. If we're moving into crisis mode, where we're in a hybrid state, or we're in a remote state, one of the things that we have learned and observed through research, through surveys, through anecdotal conversations, is that our teams, our teachers are feeling disconnected from their peers, and their peers bring safety to them. Their peers hold up a mirror much more safely for them. So that whole idea of how do I help them reflect, how do I help them go, create space. Now, one of the things when I joined the team here at 3P, straight out of a school, I worked from home, I worked from this desk 2 or 3 days a week and was in the office the rest of the week. And on those days that I was remote, I found it really hard to process my thinking sometimes, because I was in school, I'd get up, I'd leave my office, I'd speak to someone, I'd reflect on stuff, I'd speak to my AP or whoever and really try and process what was going on in my head. But here I don't have that unless I go looking for it. So I think as leaders, it's really important that we create those spaces as best we can, and we create spaces where they can reflect, where they can have an outlet, where they can share their concerns, but also just, how do I do this? What does this look like? I can't get it to work. And I think that's culture that we always want. That's culture that we seek to build and achieve, but it's also something that has been ripped away when we're not having those coffee opportunities. And we know that in many places around the world, staff rooms are places where we're really trying to build social distancing, where we're really trying to build in that physical space between the adults and so thinking about how you create that, what does it look like to create a virtual coffee time? And let me tell you, virtual coffee times are really hard work to start with. But now, I work with a team of people all over the world. I've employed people onto the team that I've never met face to face. But having a coffee with them is really significant in building team, but also helping to reflect and process and understand what's going on. So I think it's really important to think about your teams and their needs, not just in what it used to look like, but what it looks like now, and think about the skill sets that need to be developed, and really think about how that works moving forward, because that's really significant. And that's really kind of important. Chris, let me ask you a question. I know that you're a math.
Can I just speak to? Let me just speak to that very quickly. I think the best way that we can build this, one of the great impacts of this time is that we're taking more risks. We're failing fast, and then reflecting and moving on. And I think we want to foster that. That's one of the best ways of learning. But you talk about the importance of fostering that sort of culture within your staff. I think the best way to do that is to model that yourself as well. Is to actually say, look, I'm trying these things. Here's some of my failures. This is how I'm learning. So I just thought I'd add that in there. The best way of actually building that is by modeling it. So anyway, carry on. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
I think that's great, and we're going to come to self in a second. Let me ask you a question, Chris. I know that you are a high school math teacher by training. I know that you also spent a bit of time teaching outside of your subject for a little bit. And how do you face the challenges of helping people outside of their subject area? So there's a great question here from Vincent, who's teaching PE this year, fully remote, but not necessarily in his area of expertise, PE, having to be in school each day, but teaching fully remote. Any advice in a situation like that?
I think that's a really tricky one. Especially something like PE. I'd probably be trying to seek the wisdom of others, so join some communities of others that are doing a similar thing. I think one thing we can remember is, yes, there is very subject-specific content, but good pedagogy spans across all teaching. So things like building relationships, asking good questions, those types of building culture type things. So there is a lot that is, I suppose, universal, but I think that's a real challenge, and I'd be looking to get help from others. Even I know that if you look at the, I suppose, the gym scene around the world, they've had to completely revolutionize everything. So I'd probably be having a look at what they're doing in that sort of physical education space, and how they're harnessing the power of technology to have the virtual fitness classrooms and those types of things. So I think firstly acknowledging it's a real challenge, and just going to those communities, and they're out there because they're needed, and seeing what they can offer as well. It's not that helpful.
I think it's a real challenge. I think one of the things I would add on to the back of that is that I think in a situation like this, a subject like PE becomes less about skills and techniques, and more about supporting, I guess, personal development and growth in that space. So the whole idea of, and acknowledging what we said about curriculum earlier, absolutely. But I think that whole idea of helping to get the young people outside, knowing that there's a real role to play in mental well-being, if we can get them outside and doing something that they're enjoying. Obviously, there's restrictions around the place, and there's different restrictions in terms of outdoor time and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that a role like PE at the moment is really around mental well-being, encouraging them to get outside and get some fresh air. We know the benefits of that. We know the importance of that. So really be thinking about holistically the student and how we can do that, and what contribution you can have in that. All right, I'm very aware that we've got a little under 10 minutes left, or a little over 10 minutes left. And Chris and I, this is the second webinar of this title that you and I have done. So you know what's coming up now. I'm going to give my spiel that encourages people to stay to the end, not because I've got some sort of marketing thing or giveaway or anything like that, but we're going to spend the last 10 minutes talking about self. I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes talking about how you lead yourself well during this time. And as a leader, I feel like I can say this. As someone that was in schools, I feel like I can say this. I know that I did a really poor job of that as a leader. I know I did a really poor job of looking after myself at times. And I know that we put ourselves as the least important in the priority list. However, I'm going to encourage you to stay and listen to this, because if you can look after yourself, if you can put some things in place to protect yourself, you're not just looking after and doing yourself a favour, you're actually doing your team, your family, those around you a favour by doing this. So let me encourage you to hang around for the next 5 or 10 minutes when we talk a little bit about how to look after yourself. And there's two parts of it. I want to talk about how you look after yourself as an individual. I want to talk about how you look after yourself as a leader. Firstly, as an individual, let me harness what Chris said a few minutes ago. It's really important that you lead by example. So if you want your staff to be able to disconnect from a remote time and be able to not feel like, one of the big challenges was that when people were working from home, they felt like they were always at work. And I know that that's a real challenge for me. I come into my office, I this temptation to spend all day, every day, and all night, every night in my office. And so step away, put in some place and time to lead by example, and show your team that you're not always working, you're not always doing this, you're building in some space and time for yourself. I think that's really important. Looking after your own health is really important. You can't expect your team to do it if you're not going to do it. And that's really important. And sometimes that's around managing expectations of emails. One of the things that I didn't realize for a long time as a leader was that my team felt pressure and expectation when they got an email from me. And if they got an email from me at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, there was a whole host of them that felt like they had to action it and do something about it. And it took me saying to them, look, just because I'm working at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night does not mean that I expect you to be. And so that whole idea of, I realized as a leader the power of my presence. An email lands in the inbox from the boss, I better get to it, I better deal with it. I don't want that. I want to do my work when I want to work, and I want to be able to be flexible, but I don't want the pressure to be felt on my team. So really, I had to be explicit. Look, guys, you get an email from me. I don't need you to respond to it there and then, particularly if it's out of hours. You manage your time, you sort yourself out. So I think that's really important and really significant. Chris, is there anything you would add in terms of individual before we talk about the leader?
Yeah, probably not much. I just know that there are strategies that you can use, even like sort of scheduled email sending. Sometimes even when you say something, it doesn't hit home as hard. So there are definitely strategies and things that you can put in place to ensure that. But that modeling is extremely important, because your staff will watch you, and even if you say look after yourself and you're not, then they're gonna follow your lead. But I think also, especially in this climate, a high trust environment is one that's conducive of getting the best work and the best well-being. A high trust, and that means not micromanaging. That means, I suppose, employing the person rather to do their job as who they are, rather than to do the job that you want them to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the other part of self is self as a leader. There are expectations on you from above, I've got no doubt, from district, from local authority, from parents. This is not a normal year, and this is not going to be a normal year. And I'm, that's a statement of the obvious if ever there was going to be one. And so therefore, the way that you operate, your leadership, your expectations, the boxes that you tick are not going to be normal boxes. And so, I think about things like school improvement plans, school improvement agendas. Are schools going to improve this year? I really hope so. Are we going to get to the end of the year and do things differently? I hope so. But that doesn't mean that we approach things like, for example, school improvement in the same way. This is maybe a time to reflect on your school improvement journey, how you do it, what your documentation looks like, what your agendas look like, and adjust accordingly. I've been talking to principals, and one of the pieces of advice I've been giving them over the last 6 months here in Australia is we often tend in a time of crisis to just batten down the hatches and let's get through, head down, push through, keep doing, tick, 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 get to the end, thank goodness that's over, let's go back to the way it was. And I actually think that this time is a time where we actually will not go back to how things were. Yeah, there are things that we will go back and harness, but there are things that we're going to learn. So as you go through this a year, as you go through the journey, find somewhere to note down the things that have worked. You don't have to process them, you don't have to reflect on them now. Just make notes. And when you're in a better space, you'll be able to reflect on them. It's about that whole idea of moving from surviving that you're doing to now to thriving. And a thriving environment post this pandemic will not be what thriving looked like before it. And so as you think about your school improvement agenda for this year, as you think about what success will look like through this year, be kind to yourself, adjust accordingly, and think about little steps that you need to take to move from surviving to thriving, from unsustainable to sustainable. And in doing that, it's just one step at a time, each and every step of the journey. And I think that's really, really important. It's really important that we navigate it that way. Chris, anything to add there?
No, I think that's good. I think making making things sustainable, especially I think as leaders, we're often guilty of building in these great plans, but they're just not sustainable. Even more now, that's important. But one thing we're doing here, and one thing I know that teachers are doing, is they're actually saying, we've been handed this wonderful opportunity, this hardship, yes, but through hardship we've had to grow, we've had to adapt, we've had to change. And so they're just saying, well, what are the strengths? What are the things that we want to keep from before this pandemic? What are the things that we've learned and grown to do well within the pandemic? And then moving forward, what we want to have is we want to have that combination of the best things. So basically, saying what are the best things from both those worlds as we move forward. We've got this wonderful opportunity. I think we've all been hoping education would be revolutionised for a long time, and wondering how it's going to happen. This might be that opportunity. Where we get to make those big changes. So I'd probably be trying to leverage and harness what's happened throughout this pandemic, and ensuring that changes my school community for the better.
Excellent, thank you. I want to kind of wrap up now, because I know that the most important thing about PDs for teachers is finishing on time, and a joke, but it's significant. I want to thank you. I know how important your time is. On the screen, you'll see Chris's details, my details. We'd love feedback. We'd love your thoughts. We'd love any other webinars that you think would be helpful that we could work on to present to you. Please connect with us. Help us out. I just want to finish off by commending you as a school leader, as someone who has been in schools in non-pandemic times. I know how difficult it is. I know how challenging it is to lead a school through challenge, through tragedy, through anxiety, and all of those things. And right now, I know that leaders are doing it really tough. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing. I want to encourage you to look after yourself. I want to encourage you to think about yourself and your teams. I want to thank you, look after yourself, sustain your community, and keep going. We will get through this. We will come out the other end. We will move from that surviving to thriving, and hopefully education will be better as a result of this. So thank you for all you're doing, and I look forward to seeing you next time at one of our webinars. Thanks now. Have a great day.